It was a quiet afternoon in California. The sun hung low in the sky, giving everything that warm golden glow that Clint Eastwood always loved. He had spent the morning driving along the coastline, windows down, a light breeze brushing his face. He wasn't in a hurry. At his age, he had learned to enjoy silence more than speed. The road stretched out like a ribbon of calm, and he was perfectly fine being alone with his thoughts. After an hour or so, he saw a small diner on the side of the road. It was one of those old-fashioned spots with big glass windows and a flickering neon sign that read, "Coffee and Pie." The kind of place where time moved slowly, where people still talked to each other instead of staring at phones. Clint decided to stop. He parked his car under a tree, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the faint sound of the ocean in the distance. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee, butter, and something sweet baking in the oven. The bell over the door jingled as he stepped in. A few people looked up, but no one made a fuss. Clint wasn't wearing anything that drew attention, just an old leather jacket, jeans, and sunglasses. He liked it that way. Fame was something he had learned to carry quietly, like a shadow. He took a seat near the window and ordered a coffee. Black, no sugar. The waitress, an older lady with kind eyes, smiled when she recognized him but didn't say anything. She respected privacy, and Clint appreciated that. He nodded his thanks and sipped the coffee, letting the warmth settle in. That's when he noticed the sound. The low growl of engines outside. A few seconds later, 5 or 6 motorcycles pulled up in front of the diner. The noise broke the calm of the afternoon like thunder. The riders stepped off their bikes laughing loudly, boots stomping on the gravel. They looked like a rough bunch. Leather jackets, chains, and tattoos that told 100 stories. They walked in together and the diner suddenly felt smaller. Clint didn't pay them much attention. He had seen all kinds of people in his life, but he couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere shifted. The quiet murmur of conversation faded as the group took over 2 tables near the counter. They ordered loudly, teased the waitress, and made jokes that weren't as funny as they thought. Most people in the diner kept their heads down, pretending not to notice. Clint simply turned his attention to the view outside. The sun had started to dip lower, painting the road in gold and orange. He thought about how peaceful life had become after years of movie sets, interviews, and cameras. Now he only wanted moments like these, quiet ones. But peace has a strange way of testing those who seek it. When the waitress brought another round of coffee to the bikers, one of them bumped into Clint's table while passing by. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a wild beard and a smirk that looked permanent. The hot coffee spilled slightly, splashing across the table and onto Clint's sleeve. The man turned halfway, grinning like it was nothing. "Oops," he said carelessly. "Didn't see you there, old man." Clint looked at his sleeve. The hot liquid had left a mark, but he didn't react. He just dabbed it with a napkin, calm and quiet. "No problem," he said in a steady voice. "Just watch where you're going next time." The biker didn't like that. Maybe he was used to people getting scared or shouting back. But Clint's calmness seemed to annoy him even more. "Watch where I'm going?" he repeated, his grin fading. "You got a problem?" Clint looked up slowly, his eyes steady behind the sunglasses. "No," he said simply. "Not unless you make one." The biker stared at him, maybe trying to figure out if he was being challenged. The other riders started to chuckle, sensing some drama. Clint didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't even frown. He just sat there, calm as a rock in a storm. That kind of quiet strength can be more intimidating than shouting ever could. The man finally laughed it off, but there was tension in the air. He muttered something under his breath and walked back to his seat. The others slapped him on the back, teasing him for backing down to a grandpa. Clint ignored them. He had no interest in fights or proving anything. But sometimes trouble doesn't need an invitation. A few minutes passed. Clint finished his coffee and asked for the check. The waitress hesitated, glancing toward the group. "Maybe you should wait a bit," she said softly. "They're in a mood today." Clint smiled. "I'll be fine," he said kindly. "Thank you." As he stood up to leave, one of the bikers, probably the youngest, decided to test him. He stretched his leg across the aisle, blocking Clint's path. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, grinning. "We were just getting to know each other." Clint paused. His patience was still steady, but he didn't like disrespect. He looked down at the leg stretched out in front of him and then back up at the man. "Move your leg," he said quietly. The young biker leaned back in his seat. "Or what?" The diner went silent. Even the sound of the ceiling fan seemed to fade. Clint could feel every eye on him, but he wasn't angry. He had learned long ago that anger only gave power to the other person. He just waited, still as a mountain, until the man moved his leg. It wasn't Clint's tone that made him move. It was something else, something in his presence that demanded respect without a single raised word. Clint nodded once and started walking toward the door. But before he could reach it, the same biker who had spilled the coffee stood up again. His pride had clearly been wounded in front of his friends. "Hey," he said loudly, stepping forward. "You think you can talk to us like that and just walk away?" Clint turned, meeting his gaze. "I think that's exactly what I'm doing. That only made things worse." The man's jaw tightened. He took another step forward, his friends watching eagerly. The waitress looked nervous now, whispering for someone to call the police, but Clint raised a hand slightly, signaling that it wasn't necessary. "I don't want any trouble," Clint said evenly. "You had your fun. Let's leave it there." But the biker wasn't listening. He shoved Clint lightly on the shoulder, not enough to hurt, but enough to provoke. The diner gasped. Clint took one small step back, straightened his jacket, and looked at the man without a hint of fear. "You don't want to do that," he said in a tone so calm it almost sounded friendly. The man scoffed. "Oh yeah, why's that?" Clint's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Because you'll regret it." The biker laughed, thinking he was bluffing. He raised his hand again, this time ready to push harder. But before he could even touch him, Clint shifted slightly to the side. The motion was so fast that most people didn't even see what happened. The biker stumbled forward off balance, and Clint gently guided him past, turning his movement into his own downfall. It was effortless, like watching someone redirect a gust of wind. The man caught himself before falling completely, glaring in confusion. He couldn't understand how this older man had moved so smoothly. There was no aggression in Clint's movements, only precision. The biker opened his mouth to say something, but Clint spoke first. "Sit down," he said quietly. "You've already lost." Something in that voice made even his friends hesitate. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. The biker's pride fought against his instinct, but finally he backed off, muttering to himself as he returned to his seat. Clint didn't gloat or even look pleased. He just adjusted his jacket again, placed some cash on the counter, and told the waitress to keep the change. As he reached the door, one of the older bikers, the one who hadn't said much, called out. "Hey, wait a minute," he said, his voice calmer. "You're Clint Eastwood, aren't you?" Clint paused for a moment, then gave a small nod. "That's right," he said simply. The diner went completely silent. Even the troublemakers didn't seem to know what to say. Recognition spread across their faces like a slow wave. The man who had caused the spill swallowed hard. He had seen Clint's movies, seen the way he carried himself on screen, but seeing that same calm power in real life was something else entirely. Clint didn't wait for reactions. He just walked out the door, the bell jingling softly behind him. Outside, the evening air felt cooler, quieter. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove off down the road without looking back. Inside the diner, the group sat quietly for a while. No one laughed or bragged anymore. One of them finally broke the silence. "Man," he said softly, "we almost picked a fight with Clint Eastwood." The older biker shook his head. "And we're lucky he didn't fight back." The waitress gave a little smile as she cleared the tables. "He's got a black belt, you know," she said, "and more self-control than most people I've met." Outside, the sound of Clint's car faded into the distance. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the hills, leaving behind that last stretch of golden light. For him, it was just another quiet stop on another quiet day. But for those who saw it, the moment would stay with them forever. Story they'd tell and retell about the day a group of bikers learned a lesson about respect from a man who didn't need to raise his voice or throw a punch to prove his strength. The sun had already dipped behind the hills when Clint's car rolled slowly through the quiet roads outside the small town. The sky was a mix of deep orange and purple now, that short time before night really takes over. He drove with one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting near the window, feeling the cool air brush his skin. He wasn't angry about what had happened at the diner. If anything, he felt a strange calm, that same stillness that comes after a storm. He had dealt with people like that before. Not bikers exactly, but the kind of people who mistook patience for weakness. He'd learned long ago that anger didn't solve much. It just made you tired, and Clint had no time for that kind of exhaustion anymore. Still, as he replayed the scene in his head, the way the young man had looked, the nervous laughter of the group, he couldn't help but wonder what drove people to act that way. Pride, fear, maybe just the need to prove something. The road curved along a long stretch of pine trees. He slowed down when he saw a small gas station ahead, its lights flickering like fireflies in the dim evening. He pulled over, parked near the pump, and stepped out. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and pine needles. The clerk inside gave him a nod as Clint filled up his tank. Everything felt still again. As he was about to leave, he noticed a reflection in the mirror, headlights approaching. The familiar low rumble of motorcycles followed. He sighed quietly. Part of him had already expected this. Within minutes, the same group of bikers from the diner pulled into the gas station, their engines growling like restless animals. The leader, the one who had spilled coffee earlier, swung off his bike first. The others followed behind, their laughter echoing in the open space. Clint didn't flinch. He finished pumping gas, replaced the nozzle, and closed the cap. "Well, look who it is," the leader said with a smirk. "The movie star himself." Clint turned slowly, calm as ever. "Evening," he said simply. The leader crossed his arms. "You just walked out of that diner like you owned the place. You made my guys look like fools." "I didn't make anyone look like anything," Clint replied. "You did that yourselves." The tone wasn't mocking. It was just honest, plain truth said quietly. But sometimes truth can sting harder than insults. A few of the bikers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. One of them spoke up. "Man, we didn't know who you were." "It was just some fun." Clint gave a small nod. "Fun's fine as long as no one gets hurt. But you might want to think about what kind of fun that really is." The leader didn't like being lectured, especially in front of his crew. He stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You think you can just walk away from us again?" he said, lowering his voice. Clint didn't back away. His posture stayed the same, balanced, relaxed. "I'm not walking away from anyone," he said quietly. "I'm just not walking into nonsense." For a second, no one spoke. The sound of the wind moved through the trees, soft but noticeable. Then the older biker, the one who had recognized Clint in the diner, spoke up. "Leave it, man," he said to the leader. "This isn't worth it. But pride's a strange thing. It whispers louder than reason." The leader gave a half laugh. "You scared of him?" The older man shook his head. "No, I've just seen enough to know when to stop." The leader turned back toward Clint, but the energy in the group had already shifted. The others weren't laughing anymore. They weren't sure what to do. Back their friend or listen to their instinct. Clint could sense the tension thinning, but he also knew how easily it could flip again. He spoke slowly, his tone calm, steady. "You've got a good group," he said. "You just need to lead them better." That line seemed to land harder than anything else. The leader froze for a moment, staring at Clint. For some reason, those words hit him differently, maybe because deep down, he knew they were true. He looked away, pretending to adjust his jacket. Clint didn't linger. He nodded once at the group, then opened his car door. Before he got in, he looked back at them and said, "Take care of yourselves." He drove off quietly, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a silence the bikers didn't quite know what to do with. For a long moment, no one spoke. The younger ones kicked at the gravel, pretending not to care, while the older man just watched the car's taillights disappear into the darkness. Finally, he broke the silence. "You boys have any idea what that man's been through?" he said. "He's not just some actor. He's been training for decades. The man's got discipline most people can't even understand." The leader didn't answer. He just stood there, lost in thought. They stayed at the station for a while, talking quietly. The older biker started telling stories he'd heard, about how Clint used to practice martial arts even when filming long days, how he believed discipline mattered more than strength, how he never bragged about what he could do. The more they talked, the more the laughter faded into something else, respect, maybe even shame. They began to realize that they hadn't just messed with a famous actor. They had disrespected a man who had earned everything he had with patience, hard work, and humility. The leader didn't say much after that. When they finally started their engines again, the noise didn't sound like it did before. It wasn't wild or loud. It was quieter, almost thoughtful. Meanwhile, Clint drove deeper into the night, the road empty except for the hum of his engine. He felt a small ache in his chest. Not from fear, not from anger, but from the simple sadness of seeing how people could lose themselves trying to prove something. He had seen it too many times in Hollywood and real life everywhere. People trying to act strong because they didn't know how to be calm. He pulled over near a small overlook that faced the valley below. The stars were beginning to come out bright and scattered. Clint turned off the engine and sat in silence, the cool night breeze moving through the open window. For a long while, he didn't move. He thought about the young biker, the one who had stretched his leg in the diner. There had been fear behind his grin. Clint could see it now. Fear of being overlooked. Fear of being small in a world that always felt big and cold. He remembered his younger days, the endless auditions, the rejections, the times when no one believed in him. He had felt small too once. Maybe that's why he didn't hold grudges. Everyone was fighting something, even the loud ones. Especially the loud ones. His phone buzzed softly on the passenger seat. It was a message from an old friend, a simple check-in asking if he'd reached home yet. Clint smiled faintly and replied that he was fine. He didn't mention what had happened. Some things didn't need to be told. When he finally decided to head back, the night had grown colder. He started the engine again, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The world outside was quiet, peaceful again. Back in town, the bikers had stopped at a small bar. The mood was different this time, quieter. They talked about movies, about the old days, about what it meant to be respected without having to act tough. The leader sat in silence for a while before finally speaking. "You ever look at someone and realize you've been doing it wrong?" he said softly. No one answered right away, but they all knew what he meant. The older biker smiled faintly. "Takes a real man to admit that," the leader nodded.
"Guess I just met one who reminded me." They laughed quietly.
Not the wild kind of laughter they had earlier, but the kind that comes when people start to see things clearly. By the next morning, the story had already begun to spread. People in the town started whispering about how a group of bikers had crossed paths with Clint Eastwood and walked away humbled, not hurt. It wasn't about a fight or a confrontation. It was about the quiet way he handled it. About the respect that followed him like a shadow. Clint never mentioned it again. For him, it was just another day, another reminder that real power isn't loud. It doesn't shout, doesn't need to be proven. It's silent, steady, and rooted deep inside. The kind that makes people stop and think instead of react. The bikers, on the other hand, carried that night with them for a long time. Some of them changed in small ways. They started treating people differently. The waitresses, the strangers, even each other. They didn't always talk about it, but it was there, like a quiet shift in the air. And somewhere on a long stretch of road, Clint Eastwood drove under the stars, the hum of the car steady, his mind at ease. He didn't need to look back. The world had its noise, but he had found his peace a long time ago. That's what real strength looks like, not in fists, not in words, but in how calmly a man walks away from chaos, leaving only silence and respect behind. The next morning, the sky was painted in soft shades of pink and gold. A gentle breeze moved through the trees outside Clint's cabin. He had returned late last night, tired but peaceful. The quiet of his home always brought him comfort. It sat on a hill outside the city, surrounded by nature, a place where he could think, write, and just be. He made himself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled fresh, like pine and wet earth. He leaned on the railing, staring out at the wide view of the valley below. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear a faint hum of cars from the highway. Life kept moving no matter what happened. That was something he'd always admired about the world. It never stopped, no matter how big or small a moment felt. He thought again about the bikers from the night before. Not out of anger or pride, but out of quiet reflection. People like that always reminded him of how easily things could go wrong if pride took the driver's seat. He hadn't wanted to embarrass them. He only wanted to remind them, and maybe himself, that peace didn't come from showing power. It came from controlling it. He had learned that lesson a long time ago, back when he was still young and full of fire. Martial arts had taught him patience, not violence. Every move, every breath had meaning. His old instructor used to say, "The moment you lose control of yourself, you've already lost the fight." Clint had carried that lesson through every part of his life. In his acting, in his directing, even in his silence. He smiled slightly, thinking about how strange it was that some random roadside diner had turned into another lesson, not just for those men, but for him too. Even after all these years, life still found ways to remind him of the basics. After breakfast, he decided to drive into town. He needed a few groceries and wanted to pick up some new books. The drive was peaceful. Just the hum of the engine, the sunlight flickering through trees, and that steady rhythm of the road. When he arrived at the small market, a few people recognized him, offering friendly nods and smiles. He always handled that with quiet grace. Fame never changed how he treated people. He believed everyone deserved respect, no matter who they were. As he walked through the aisles, he heard two young men talking by the counter. They were excited, whispering about something they had seen on social media. One of them said, "Did you see that story about Clint Eastwood at the diner? Man, that's crazy." Clint stopped for a moment, hiding a small grin. He hadn't expected the story to spread so fast. People loved stories like that, ones where someone stayed calm in the face of trouble. It gave them hope, reminded them that strength didn't have to be loud. The cashier, an older man with a kind face, noticed him and smiled. "Looks like you made the news again," he said. "Something about a few bikers learning some manners?" Clint chuckled softly. "People love to talk," he said. "Sometimes the story grows bigger than what really happened." The cashier nodded. "Maybe, but sometimes people need stories like that, ones that remind them there's still some grace left in this world." Clint didn't argue. Maybe he was right. Maybe it wasn't such a bad thing for people to hear about a calm response instead of a fight. After paying for his groceries, he walked back to his car. He placed the bags on the back seat and paused for a moment before getting in. Across the street near a small gas station, he noticed 3 motorcycles parked together. His first thought was that they looked familiar. A second later, his guess was confirmed. It was them, part of the same group from before. But this time they weren't laughing or causing trouble. They were just sitting on a low wall, drinking water and talking quietly. When they noticed him, they froze for a second, clearly unsure whether to approach or not. Clint decided to make it easy for them. He walked over slowly, his steps calm, his face neutral. When he got close, one of the younger bikers stood up. He looked nervous but respectful. "Sir," he began, we wanted to say sorry for how we acted." Clint looked at him, then at the others. "You don't owe me an apology," he said gently. "Just learn something from it." The older biker, the one who had defended him at the gas station, I nodded. "We did," he said. "You handled that whole thing better than any of us would have." "Made us think," Clint smiled faintly. "Thinking's a good start." There was a brief pause. None of them seemed to know what to say next. Then the young one spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You really have a black belt, right?" Clint chuckled softly. "A long time ago. I trained for years. But that's not what matters. The belt doesn't make the man. How you carry yourself does." The young man nodded slowly, taking that in. The leader of the group wasn't there that morning, maybe still nursing his pride. But these few clearly wanted to make things right. One of them said, "We didn't mean to disrespect you. We just sometimes act dumb when we're together. You know, trying to show off." Clint's tone stayed kind but firm. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said. "Real strength shows up in silence, not noise." They stood there for a moment, nodding. There was no awkwardness now, just quiet understanding. Before leaving, one of them said, "We'll tell our friend we were wrong. He'll come around eventually." Clint nodded. "Give him time. Everyone learns at their own pace." They thanked him again, shook his hand, and got on their bikes. When they rode off, they didn't roar down the road like before. They drove steady and calm, helmets on, no shouting, no showing off. It made Clint smile as he watched them go. Maybe that small moment had done more good than he realized. Later that afternoon, Clint stopped by his favorite cafe in town. It was quiet, with soft music playing and the smell of coffee filling the air. He sat by the window with the newspaper, reading the headlines. Sure enough, one of the local columns had written about the incident at the diner. The story had been stretched a bit and more dramatic than it had really been, but at least the message was clear. The article described Clint's calm reaction and how he diffused the situation without a single act of aggression. It called him a true example of grace under pressure. Clint couldn't help but smile at the choice of words. Grace. That was something he valued more than anything now. As he read, a man sitting nearby spoke up. "It's good to see stories like that still make the news," he said. "Shows people there's another way to deal with conflict." Clint looked up, recognizing him as a retired police officer he'd met once before. The world needs calm more than it needs heroes, Clint replied. The man nodded. Amen to that. They talked for a while, about life, about how things had changed, about how hard it was to stay patient in a world that moved too fast. Clint listened more than he spoke. That was his way. When he finally left the cafe, the sun was beginning to set again, turning the town golden. He walked slowly back to his car, feeling a quiet sense of peace. Maybe, he thought, small moments like these still made a difference. Not every lesson had to be loud or dramatic. Some were whispered in small places, in diners, gas stations, or quiet roads, and still found their way into people's hearts. As he drove home, the road ahead seemed endless and free. He turned on the radio, an old country song playing softly. The wind came in through the open window, carrying the scent of grass and earth. Everything felt right again. That night, he sat by the fireplace with a notebook, jotting down a few thoughts. Not for a movie, not for anyone else, just for himself. He wrote about respect, about patience, about how age didn't weaken a man if he carried his wisdom well. He thought about the young biker again, the look in his eyes when he apologized. There had been sincerity there, and that was enough for Clint. It meant that moment wasn't wasted. He closed the notebook, leaned back in his chair, and stared into the fire. The flames flickered softly, reflecting in his calm eyes. He didn't feel like a hero or a teacher, just a man who'd lived long enough to know that kindness and strength could exist in the same breath. The next day, when he went for his morning walk, the world seemed quieter. The birds sang above the trees, and the morning sun warmed the path ahead. Somewhere far away, maybe those bikers were riding again, a little wiser, a little quieter, and a little more aware of what real strength looked like. And that, Clint thought with a faint smile, was more than enough. When the biker leader realized who he was standing in front of, his laughter faded into a nervous smile. The whole diner had gone silent after that brief moment when Clint moved so fast that nobody could even understand what just happened. The man who had tried to grab him was now on his feet again, still shaken but unharmed. Clint had helped him up with a steady hand, showing no anger at all. That small act of kindness seemed to confuse everyone more than anything else. The air was thick, like the calm after a sudden storm. People in the diner didn't know whether to speak or just keep watching. The bikers looked at each other, unsure what to do next. Clint didn't move aggressively. He just stood there, straight and calm, like someone who had nothing to prove. His eyes held that same quiet strength that made people listen without a word being said. The biker leader tried to brush it off. He gave a half-hearted laugh and said, "All right, man, we didn't mean nothing by it. Just a little fun, you know." His voice was loud but lacked the earlier confidence. He was trying to save face in front of his crew. Clint looked at him with that same calm stare and replied in a low, even tone, "There's a difference between fun and disrespect." Those words hit harder than a punch. The leader's smile faded completely. For a second, he looked like he wanted to argue, but something about Clint's presence made him stop. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier arrogance now replaced by awkward silence. Clint didn't continue the argument. He turned his back to them and walked back to his seat at the counter. The waitress, who had been frozen in place the whole time, finally moved again. She looked at him with wide eyes and asked softly if he was all right. He nodded once and said, "I'm fine, thank you." Then he quietly picked up his coffee cup again as if nothing had happened. The rest of the diner slowly came back to life. A few whispers started here and there. Someone near the door muttered, "That's Clint Eastwood. I swear it is." The realization spread quickly through the room. People began to recognize him, the familiar face, the calm voice, the unmistakable confidence. The bikers noticed it too. Their expressions changed from defiance to discomfort. They hadn't just picked on some random traveler. They'd messed with a man known worldwide for his quiet power and strong sense of justice. The leader rubbed the back of his neck, looking down at the floor, unsure how to handle the situation now. Clint didn't take advantage of their confusion. He wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. Instead, he finished his coffee, placed a few bills on the counter, and got up to leave. But before he walked out, he turned slightly toward the group and said, "You guys should take it easy on people. You don't know who you're dealing with sometimes." The leader nodded slowly, not saying a word. Clint's voice wasn't threatening, it was almost fatherly. It carried the weight of experience and self-control. Then with that familiar steady walk, he made his way toward the door. The little bell above it jingled softly as he stepped outside. The bikers followed him out, but this time not to confront him. They just watched as he walked toward his truck. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Clint opened the door, paused for a moment, and looked back at them. He gave a small nod, not as a challenge but as a gesture of respect, and then got in his truck. As the sound of his engine faded down the road, the bikers stood in silence for a long moment. The leader finally exhaled and said, "Man," that was Clint Eastwood, "we just tried to start a fight with Clint Eastwood." One of the younger bikers rubbed his arm where he'd been flipped onto the floor earlier and said quietly, "He could have hurt me bad, but he didn't." The leader nodded. Yeah, he could have. His tone was different now. It wasn't defensive anymore, it was thoughtful. That moment, short as it was, had shaken something inside him. He wasn't used to being put in his place without violence or shouting. Clint's calm control had said more than any fight ever could. Back inside the diner, people started talking again. The waitress leaned on the counter, still looking toward the door as if she expected Clint to walk back in. "That was something," she said softly to a customer nearby. He didn't even raise his voice. The customer nodded. "That's what real strength looks like," he said. Outside, the bikers gathered near their motorcycles. The leader told his crew to cool off and keep their attitudes in check. "We don't need to be acting tough everywhere we go," he said. "You never know who's watching." His voice carried more humility than usual. Later that evening, they rode out of town in a quieter mood. The roar of their engines was still loud, but the energy had changed. The younger bikers kept glancing at their leader, waiting for him to joke about what happened, but he didn't. He was lost in thought, remembering Clint's steady eyes and calm tone. That short encounter had said something to him. Something about discipline, respect, and the kind of power that doesn't need to be shouted. Clint, meanwhile, drove down the empty highway with the window slightly open. The cool air brushed against his face as he watched the fading sunlight. He wasn't angry or proud. To him, it was just another reminder of how people sometimes mistake patience for weakness. He had learned long ago that strength wasn't about fighting, it was about knowing when not to. He stopped at a gas station a few miles later to fill up his truck. The attendant, a young man in his 20s, recognized him instantly. "Hey, you're Clint Eastwood, right?" the man asked with a mix of excitement and respect. Clint gave a small smile and nodded. The attendant grinned wide. "Man, I've seen all your movies." "You're a legend," Clint chuckled softly. "Thanks, kid," he said. "Just a guy who's been around a while." The young man handed him his receipt, still grinning. "You know, you look exactly like in the movies. Cool and calm." Clint gave a small shrug and replied, "It's just life. You stay calm, things usually work out." Then he got back in his truck and drove off again, leaving the young man standing there smiling to himself. Back at the diner, word of the incident spread quickly around town. By the next morning, everyone seemed to know that Clint Eastwood had stopped by and quietly taught a few loud bikers a lesson in humility. The waitress, who had seen the whole thing, told the story again and again to new customers who came in asking about it. Each time she told it, she emphasized one thing: how calm he was. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to fight, she'd say. He just stood there and they all backed down. It was like watching a real-life movie scene. The bikers didn't return to that diner for a long time. When they finally did, months later, they were different. They walked in politely, greeted the waitress, and behaved themselves. The same waitress smiled when she saw them. She could tell they'd changed. Maybe not completely, but something had shifted. Respect had replaced arrogance. Sometimes a lesson doesn't need to be spoken out loud. Sometimes it's taught through silence, through presence, through the kind of strength that doesn't need an audience. Clint had shown them that. And in doing so, he reminded everyone who heard the story that real toughness isn't about winning a fight. It's about not needing to start one. That night, after the bikers had gone home, the diner grew quiet again. The waitress looked out the window at the long, empty road where Clint had driven off. The sky was dark now, with a few stars shining faintly above. She smiled to herself and whispered, "What a man." In the days that followed, people in town spoke about the event like it was a scene out of one of Clint's old films, simple, powerful, and unforgettable. But to Clint, it was just another day. He had lived enough life to know that small moments can teach big lessons. That single evening had changed more hearts than any speech could. As for the bikers, they began treating people differently wherever they went. They didn't brag about what happened, they didn't need to. It had become something private, something that reminded them to think twice before acting tough. The leader especially carried that memory with him. Every time he looked at a new town, a new crowd, or another stranger at a diner, he remembered Clint's steady eyes and the quiet authority behind them. It humbled him. Sometimes the people who teach us the biggest lessons aren't trying to teach us anything at all. They're just being themselves. That's what Clint Eastwood had done that day. No speech, no grand display, just calm dignity and quiet strength. And somewhere out there on the open road, Clint drove through the night not knowing, or perhaps knowing all too well, that the calm way he handled one small moment had left a mark that would last a lifetime for the men who witnessed it. The night after the diner incident, Clint Eastwood returned to his quiet cabin on the outskirts of town. The world around him was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. He parked his truck, shut the engine off, and stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. The sky stretched endlessly above, sprinkled with stars that shimmered like tiny lights in the darkness. He looked up, letting the calm wash over him. There was no thrill in what had happened, no sense of victory. For Clint, life had always been about small lessons learned and shared quietly. But he knew somewhere a few people had learned something they would never forget. The bikers, who had walked into the diner with bravado and noise, had left with a different understanding. It wasn't just about them, though. It was about the small ripple that one calm person could create. The following morning, Clint went for a long walk down the winding trails near his cabin. The air was crisp, the sunlight soft, filtering through the tall pine trees. He walked slowly, hands behind his back, thinking about the way people sometimes sought respect in all the wrong ways. The biker's actions were familiar, a display of strength meant to mask uncertainty. He had seen it many times in his life, in movies, on film sets, even in the world outside his career. As he walked, he reflected on the idea of true strength. It wasn't in force or loudness. It wasn't in winning a fight or being feared. Strength was quiet, steady, and consistent. It was in discipline, in patience, and in knowing when to act and when to wait. Clint had carried that knowledge through decades, honing it in martial arts, on film sets, and in the countless situations life had placed before him. The bikers had experienced it firsthand, though they hadn't fully realized it. Back in town, the story had spread quietly. Some of the diner's regulars shared it with friends. Others mentioned it at local coffee shops. But the story was never exaggerated. People talked about the calm manner in which Clint had handled himself, the restraint he had shown, and the subtle but powerful way he had demonstrated that strength did not require loudness or aggression. The narrative that formed wasn't about fighting, it was about character. The bikers, meanwhile, continued to carry the weight of the encounter in their own way. The leader in particular had changed, though he wasn't vocal about it. He no longer sought to dominate every conversation or prove himself by aggression. There was a quiet reflection that followed him now, a sense that actions and respect mattered more than displays of bravado. The younger members of the group noticed it too, and slowly their behavior began to shift. Small gestures of courtesy replaced impulsive actions. They held doors, spoke politely to strangers, and learned to pause before acting. One day, a few weeks after the diner incident, the leader returned to the same spot, the same diner. It was quiet mid-morning, and the place smelled of fresh coffee and baked bread. He walked in with two of his companions, not to make a scene, but simply to have breakfast. The waitress looked up and gave him a knowing smile. She had been watching the changes in the group over the past few weeks and knew something had shifted. The leader nodded politely and took a seat at a corner table. No loud laughter, no posturing, just quiet conversation. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was noticeable. Clint's actions had created a ripple effect, a subtle reminder that strength and respect were inseparable. Meanwhile, Clint himself remained largely unaware of the deeper impact he had made. He continued his daily routines, going for walks, writing in his notebooks, and working on small projects around his cabin. Some days he drove along the coast, enjoying the solitude and the rhythmic motion of the waves against the shore. Others he visited the town, greeting familiar faces with his characteristic calm nod. Fame had faded into the background. What mattered now was the simplicity of living well and treating others with dignity. Occasionally, he would think back to the moment in the diner, the way the young biker had hesitated, the pause in the leader's eyes, and the realization that strength did not require loudness. He didn't dwell on it. He simply allowed it to pass through his mind like a quiet memory, a lesson reaffirmed rather than a story to relive. The bikers, too, continued to evolve. One evening, the younger members found themselves in a small town several miles away from their usual routes. They were tempted to show off, to recreate the energy of their old ways, but something inside them had shifted. They remembered Clint's calm demeanor, the ease of his movements, and the unspoken power behind his quiet words. They restrained themselves, acted thoughtfully, and avoided confrontation. That single encounter had left an invisible mark, guiding their decisions even when Clint wasn't present. In the weeks that followed, other stories emerged in town. People spoke of a quiet man who had taught others humility without raising his voice. The story circulated quietly like a gentle wind, leaving its mark on those who heard it. It wasn't exaggerated or dramatized. No one added unnecessary details. It was simple, human, and real. A reminder that sometimes the most profound lessons are the ones witnessed, not shouted. Clint's life continued in its rhythm. Days passed, seasons shifted. He tended to his property, worked on small repairs, and wrote thoughts that he would rarely share with anyone. Visitors occasionally stopped by, some recognizing him, others merely curious. He treated all of them with the same quiet courtesy, answering questions simply, nodding politely, and listening more than speaking. And yet, somewhere in the background, the ripple of the diner incident continued to influence people. The bikers' attitudes were softer, more mindful. Their interactions with others carried subtle respect. It was clear that the lesson Clint had imparted, without raising a hand, without a harsh word, was taking hold. One afternoon, Clint took his truck along a back road, the sun filtering through the trees. He noticed a lone biker riding slowly ahead. The rider glanced back, then moved aside to let Clint pass. There was a moment of recognition in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement. Clint nodded briefly and continued on his way. It was a quiet confirmation of what had happened weeks ago. Sometimes actions spoke louder than any words could. As night fell, Clint returned to his cabin. The sky was clear, the stars beginning to emerge one by one. He sat on the porch sipping a cup of tea and reflected on the idea that life often offered small opportunities to teach, to guide, or to correct without confrontation. The diner, the bikers, the quiet moments of tension, each had been an opportunity handled with calm precision. It was a reminder that real power lay not in the ability to fight, but in the ability to remain steady, composed, and humane in every situation. The world continued to turn, full of noise, distraction, and conflict. But Clint's life and the small lessons he imparted remained a testament to the strength of restraint. He understood more than most that the quiet moments often carried the greatest weight. The biker's transformation, the whispers in the diner, the stories retold by locals, all of it was proof that subtle influence could be more lasting than any overt act of force. Weeks later, the leader of the biker group spoke to his friends during a quiet ride along a coastal road. He didn't mention Clint directly. He didn't need to. But in his voice there was a new tone, one of humility and thoughtfulness. "We don't have to prove anything," he said softly. "We just need to act right and be aware. That's the kind of strength that matters." The younger bikers nodded, understanding fully without needing explanation. Their actions from that point onward reflected the shift. Simple acts of courtesy, thoughtful decisions, and a newfound patience in dealing with strangers. The encounter at the diner had become more than a story. It had become a quiet guide, shaping their behavior in ways they didn't fully realize. Clint, meanwhile, continued to live his life quietly, knowing nothing of the subtle influence he had left behind. He didn't seek recognition, nor did he wish to boast. His satisfaction came from knowing that he had lived with discipline, respect, and quiet strength, and that such qualities, when displayed even in small ways, could leave lasting impressions. In the end, the story of that encounter was remembered not for a fight, not for violence, not for drama. It was remembered for what it truly was, a lesson in calm, composed strength, in respect, and in the subtle power of presence. People told the story over coffee in small gatherings and among friends, always emphasizing how a quiet man had shifted the behavior of a group of rough bikers without ever raising his voice. And somewhere along a quiet road, under a sky full of stars, Clint Eastwood drove alone, the hum of his truck the only sound accompanying him. He didn't reflect on fame, nor did he dwell on what others thought. He simply enjoyed the rhythm of the road, the calm of the evening, and the quiet satisfaction that a small act, handled with patience and dignity, could ripple outward in ways he would never fully know. Strength, he knew, was quiet. Respect was earned through actions, not words. And the world, if only people paid attention, could be subtly guided toward better behavior by the presence of someone who carried both quietly, steadily, and with unwavering calm. The bikers had learned a lesson without being scolded, without being hit, without fear being the main factor. The townspeople had learned that sometimes silence could be more powerful than shouting, and Clint, simply by being